Dear friends, I would like to welcome you in one more episode of VIDCAST series of thematic heritage. Today, I have the pleasure to have a discussion about a fantastic topic with a good friend and a promising young scholar, Filippo Scafi, for the Renaissance and anti-Renaissance relationship. Filippo Scafi is a researcher in philosophy, PhD candidate and lecturer at the Global Center for Advanced Studies. His research focuses on the intersections of philosophical discourse, epistemology, anthropology, and psychoanalysis, with particular interest in Francois Laruelle, non-philosophy, and the politics of alternity. One of his lines of research, the one that interests us today, is an inquiry into the mechanisms of culture, the formation of subjectivity, and the conditions of the human. So, Filippo, welcome in our VIDCAST series for thematic heritage.
Thank you very much.
I think that today we have a very interesting topic and at the same time a little bit challenging because usually we are thinking and approach Renaissance only from, allow me to say, positivist point of view. And I would like to start this discussion. Of course, you can share a few things about your recent research and to continue with our first part about the ontology and the humanism of the Renaissance and the Renaissance.
Yes, no, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be invited in this. Yeah, well, my research is basically like I'm writing my dissertation, my PhD dissertation with Rocky Gengel, which is my supervisor, on Francois Laruelle and the ontological turn in anthropology. So it's a kind of a work that tries to trace the anthropological inheritance, like the philosophical inheritance of anthropology, the mechanisms of how anthropology works and wants to work from a philosophical perspective. So let's say the subject of culture has always been something very, very interesting to me. And in fact, I mean, I hope we're planning to. I sent you the proposal for a course, for a seminar about the Renaissance from the point of view of memory, of the question of memory, of time, of how it's understood, the relation between antiquity, between the future, and in the context of the Renaissance man. So yeah, that. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Super. It's really exciting, and I would love to start with this outline about the ontological and humanistic dimension of Renaissance. And if you think that we can say that what we used to call subject or the modern subject is something that is rooted in the Renaissance, or do you believe that is a little bit restricted hermeneutics to identify the subject with the Renaissance? Or do you believe that it's a kind of a continuation coming from medieval philosophy and studies?
No, yes, I think that the Renaissance can be seen as marking the ontological birth of modern humanism. It's not only, but mainly, maybe insofar as it begins to constitute, the human subject as reflexive, as self-fashioning, and increasingly autonomous in its representation. Like thinking about thinkers like Pico della Mirandola, who famously articulated this idea of this representation of the human as indetermined by nature, like a shapeshifter, a creature capable of shaping itself through reason and volition. So it's a way of representing the human even more strong than what we can think about maybe the most rationalist position from Plato, so Greek philosophy maybe, and then which Neoplatonism is something very important for the Renaissance. This image, I think, that departs sharply from theologically grounded, the theologically grounded medieval subject, repositioning like the human not as a definitive, a defined, as defined by the divine theology or divine teleology, but exactly as I said before, as a I think as a shapeshifter, suspended between bestiality and angelic potential. So in this shift, we witness the emergence of the will, so the human will, as a thematized subsite of agency, preferring the cogito of this Descartes, and where the subject is when the subject grounds itself in the certainty of its own thought. So, like, I'm thinking about art, literature, and philosophy in the Renaissance that we can probably think about them as reconfiguring meaning and representation by placing the human at the center. So, initiating a regime in which knowledge and value begin to emanate from the subject itself rather than from a transcendent or only divine order. Yet, this subject is not yet like fully modern, of course, because it remains entangled in metaphysical and religious frameworks. So, still haunted in a way by the residue of scholastic theology, even if it's a strong reaction to that. So the Renaissance subject should thus be seen not as a sovereign, not as a completely sovereign figure. Not the representation of this subject is not one of a completely sovereign figure, but as a transitional, maybe transitional one, maybe. So no longer purely defined by divine order, but not yet fully secularized.
Mhm.
Is not the fully secularized man of Enlightenment reason. So that the Renaissance can be conceived as a positive apocalypse, maybe, of the medieval world, a kind of what we could say, like we would call apocatastasis. So the mediated through the phantasmatic retrieval of the classical antiquity. So this lure of antiquity toward the representation of this kind of new humanity. I would like to remind here, like an important thinker for me, it's a kind like she's a Caribbean cultural theorist and anthropologist, even to some extent, is Sylvia Wynter, who has probably, I think she has argued that the birth of man, of the idea of man in Renaissance humanism, inaugurates not only a universal not a universal category but a specific genre of the human. So constructed within racialized, colonized, colonial, and epistemic frames. So the figure that emerges, that this rational, self-possessed, Euro-Christian subject, becomes, in Winter terms, she calls it man one. So a biocentric, a cultural specific model of the human that displaces other modes of being. So we can even think about this. We can even think about the Renaissance man as a constructive work, like a constructive work that tries to be reactive toward a certain stream of history, that mainly the medieval one, and retrieval of a certain specific side of classical history, Greek history, Roman history.
Mhm. Yes, it's also, I think that it's a little bit contradictory that we have this new positivist project, but at the same time, exactly this new autonomous perception of the human brings closer this sense of mortality and finitude and the relation between becoming and being. Do you believe that somehow causes of postmodernity and the decay and decadence could find also in through this concept of over human-centric approach that born with Renaissance? Precisely because we have this first transition beyond the divine, or this effort to distance human from the divine.
I think absolutely yes. Like, I mean, there is a an important like tragic tension here in the Renaissance humanism between the celebration of human potential. So it's
Mm,
something that comes from definitely from a theological past, important of religious structures and religious institutions, which is still at work in a Renaissance, of course. But there is also this silent awareness of, mortality, definitely. So, and it can be read. This tension can be read, I think, as a surface expression of a deeper philosophical conflict between becoming and being. Like so something that it's something that is central, absolutely crucial to even to Greek philosophy, but there is also the kind of response to the ontology that the scholastics developed. So I think that it's also can also be seen, in fact, this relation between this tension between becoming and being as a tension between creation and decay. So on one level, Renaissance thought exalts becoming, definitely, the human as a homo faber, self-fashioning agent of transformation and invention, and even of ascent. Uh, Yet beneath this affirmation lies, I think, an unresolved, a kind of what we can call an unresolved anxiety. That it's that of that every act of creation is shadowed by dissolution. So it's vulnerable, it's fragile, and this is not simply a thematic motif, I think, but a metaphysical fault line in what is developed during the Renaissance. I'm thinking about here like a good reference could be Nick Land. I think in the first for annihilation, or in Fangno Woman, I'm not sure right now, but there is this notion of oseology, right? Um, Nick Land's notion of oseology makes this tension, I think, explicit. We can think about that through about the Renaissance in a very good, in a very fruitful way. And it makes this tension explicit by grounding philosophical speculation in the material destiny of the body. Okay? So in
mm,
the bone as the site where history and flesh collapse. So one of the most funny of Land's insights regarding Derrida. No,
yeah.
there is in Margins on Philosophy, there is a whole chapter that talks about a footnote in Heidegger's Being and Time. And Land says, we have no time for that. Like, don't you feel the urgency of your body completely rotting away? No? So that's a philosophical stance. And it's a philosophical stance that we can begin to, you know, sense in the Renaissance man. A man that is brought to create with a very strong consistency. We can think about it's the age of invention. It's the age where we can look and think about Leonardo da Vinci, someone who's okay. It's even true that um, he is the image, maybe one of the images of the Renaissance, and we should not, you know, collapse the Renaissance on Leonardo da Vinci. But it's true that that kind of strength of invention, that kind of possibility of creation, of free roaming in the possibility of creation, it's something that pertains to the Renaissance first. So yeah, to conclude this, I want to relate to Frances Yates, so that it's in her exploration of Hermeticism, alongside with someone we would talk about surely, I think, with Eugenio Battisti,
Mm,
the figure of the tragic inventor, both point to this dissonance relating to becoming and being, decay and creation, that the Renaissance does not resolve the conflict between being and becoming, but aestheticizes it in a sense. So turns it into a form. What seems like affirmation is haunted by entropy, even if they did not have the concept of entropy. But and in this light, the Renaissance becomes not the dawn of modern human sovereignty, but a staging, I think of a deeper trauma, like let's say trauma, that every creative act bears within it its principle of its own, the composition. And that period is important also for that.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, and maybe for this reason, we can explain this anti-Renaissance, let's say, a wave or need. I mean that the critic of reason and somehow the expression of an effort that the human being is not this kind of teleological and linear um, um, entity that has only the creation in his mind, etc. It's something that coming from this critique against the Renaissance reason, or the reason, I mean, as something that actually unified Renaissance until the Enlightenment, all this period between Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So, tell me more about this, let's say, trend, let's say, subterranean expression around the Renaissance ideas, and how much important I think it's to to put them on the table in order to understand more about this dialogue and contradiction at the same time.
Yes. So the term anti-Renaissance is deployed for the first time, like let's say academically, by the scholar that is Eugenio Battisti, which is an Italian art critic and historian of art that was actually here in Turin, I think, for at least for a little bit of time. Then it was in Florence, and he wrote this book, which is called Anti-Renaissance. So the anti-Renaissance is not it's first of all it's influenced by scholars like Aby Warburg, and the work beneath that, like the background or the influence shows clearly that the anti-Renaissance is not to be thought or to be understood as something like a opposition to the Renaissance. But what Battisti was trying to do is actually to manifest how the Renaissance tension or the Renaissance attempt to purify, no, let's remember, like as land, like the purification of the bone in osteology, this kind, the bone as a site of the spirit. This purification was, as I said, a constructive act that actually, on the other hand, so Battisti's work can be even thought as a kind of anthropological attempt to construct the history, the actual cultural the history of the cultural dynamics during the Renaissance can be understood as a complex set of intertwinements between folkloristic superstitions, folkloristic beliefs, popular beliefs, things that came, so iconographies that came from the medieval times, and and the rationalist tensions, maybe also the mystical influences that came from the translation by Ficino of Hermetes Trismegistus, of Plato, both Plato and Plotinus, and so on. So it's a very complex period, and the anti-Renaissance, the work anti-Renaissance by Battisti can be thought exactly as that attempt to make justice to the complexity of a period like that. It's also a complexity of a period that ends up influencing modernity. So our modernity, the Enlightenment, they are all structured or originated in some way by the tensions and the tendency internal to the Renaissance already. Um, and so, like, yeah, I'd say that the best couple of thinkers to understand the anti-Renaissance, the concept of anti-Renaissance, are both Battisti and Warburg.
Mhm. Yeah, it's. I think that it's something that we needed because many times we have this kind of explanations and hermeneutics that coming, I mean, from our era backwards. And personally, feel many times, in opposition with all these ideas that are trying, for example, to identify the post-industrial or the industrial rationalism and the mathematical logic conceptualism with what's going on in the Renaissance. And, just to find a common line, exactly overcoming all the contradictions. For example, the mysticism, what's going on with the influence of Platonism and the still strong divine elements in that period. So yes, the anti-Renaissance coming and open the discussion around the field, how precise we should be when we speak about this period. And for example, I have in my mind this contradiction of Nietzsche. Nietzsche is at the same time an admirer of Renaissance, but is a Nietzsche, fragmentary and an enemy against any kind of logic and ordering of divine principles over the human. I want to delve more around this iconographic and the imaginist side of at the Renaissance. How, for example, these studies connect more these folklore elements and let's say this invisible sociology of the lower strata and a kind of invisible wisdom that coming from the lower strata of these periods around the concept of human, of divine, of fragmentary mortality or not.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually, because to be open to be able to trace the different dynamics inside the Renaissance, which is of course probably like reading the Battisti's Anti-Renaissance, which is a very heavy book and heavy, difficult, dense operation that works between art critiques, kind of philosophy, anthropology is a very difficult endeavor. Um, but of course, yeah. Well, there's a call. I think that the anti-Renaissance voices, like particularly mystics, like let's think not in the way Battisti is talking about, like this concept of a complex stratification of different influences. Let's think about more in a, let's say, simplistic terms, like the anti-Renaissance voices and those voices who pertain to what the Renaissance doesn't want or doesn't think of itself. So these particularly mystics, apophatic theologians, radical skeptics, and also the people, folklore and mythology and so on. So can let's say that these people, these voices, can even be seen as early precursor, and we remember that they are part of the Renaissance, the early precursors of the 20th century critique of logocentrism, the critique in philosophy, the critique of representation that advanced exactly as you said by Nietzsche, but Heidegger, Derrida, even Deleuze. Deleuze doesn't talk about the Renaissance too much, and it's something that is really strange to me actually. But so although many of these figures, these mystics, theologians, emerge from the late medieval period, such as I think about two mainly. Meister Eckhart, which is completely it's crucial for German culture, and it's crucial also to understand Heidegger in a sense. There is a lot of hidden or not completely hidden influence of Meister Eckhart in Heidegger. And the other one is the anonymous writer of is a British one, is a British anonymous writer of the Cloud of Unknowing. So that they remain active presences within the Renaissance, so offering a kind of subterranean resistance to its dominant celebration of reason, order, and human self-mastery, and the representation of knowledge as illumination, which is something that we already see in scholastics theology. Let's think about Saint Bonaventura, but it's radically reimagined in a classical sense, in the classical sense of Plato's agathon. So the good is also the light that sheds, that make things appear. So it's a question of seeing and it's a question of knowing then. So the emphasis, the mystics and theological emphasis on unknowing, on silence, on ecstatic non-duality undermines the very epistemic and ontological certitudes of the Renaissance. That's very impressive because it's something that creates the Renaissance, creates the influences of the Renaissance together. So this tension, I think, between rational clarity and mystical obscurity, between then logos and what we can call alogos, can be mapped as I think, as you suggested, also into a kind of like a neurocognitive polarity. So a war
Mm.
between hemispheres, no? Hemispheres of the brain. So the left hemisphere, what is analytical, linear, categorizing, and aligns with Renaissance trust in proportion, geometry, philology, control. So philology is very important to retrieve the past texts, because in the past text, the classical text, there is truth. So the right hemisphere instead is while this with its orientation toward ambiguity, intuition, holism, silence, even finds expression in mystical text, exactly and poetic disruptions and negative theology. And I think about figures like Paracelsus, that embody this other side of the Renaissance. A physician and alchemist who rejected the mechanistic models of scholasticism in favor of a cosmology rooted in correspondence, occult sympathies, and inner intuitions, inner revelations, even. So, in this light, the Renaissance is not a unified celebration of reason, and that is how to understand Renaissance and anti-Renaissance, but a contested space, so a place of agon, a site where the metaphysics of light, that of clarity, being, knowledge, the more Platonic one, is haunted by the shadow of knowing, or the cloud of unknowing, as um, that anonymous British writer, theologian said. So if we think about Nietzsche, as you said before, actually, affirmation of Dionysian chaos over Apollinian order in the critique of in a broader critique of philosophy that he does that he makes in The Birth of Tragedy. So Heidegger's critique of metaphysics also and the forgetting of being, Derrida's deconstruction of the privileges of logos. So all these 20th century moves echo in a strange, retrograde way the mystic refusal of ratio, no, as the highest mode of access to truth. So that, and here we are talking of, I think, an inalienable, sorry, sometimes influence of the Middle Ages. So, if anyone has had the fortune, for example, to read The Cloud of Unknowing, and which is from the 14th century. So the seeds of what will be, what we will find in Saint John's of the Cross, for example, the Dark Night of the Soul, it's already laid there. So the true nature of the soul's enlightenment as is the abandonment of reason. It's a true critique then of Plato, of
Yeah.
Neoplatonism in some sense, and yeah, like to quote John of the Cross, there is this passage in the poem, "The Dark Night of Dark Night of the Soul," that is like, um, "This light guided me more surely than the light of noonday." So it's the line of noonday that Plato sees when the philosopher sees when he comes out of the cave. And St. Joseph of the Cross says, "More surely than the light of noonday, to the place where he, well, I know who," says John, "was awaiting me, a place where none appeared." So it's a direct opposition to to classical rationalism in a sense. So yeah, this one of the examples, the many examples that we can think about in this particular crucible of tendency that is the Renaissance.
Yeah, Filippo, I love your description. It's exactly like that. I have in my mind that even the giants of Western rationalism, like Isaac Newton or Leibniz, in their lives, during their lives, were expressed this contradiction between the light and the darkness, a passionate theological research about the unknown, and at the same time, a fantastic scientific work for a whole life in eternity. So I use these two figures because we used to know them as the pillars of a certain kind of rationalism, but a certain reading of their biography can prove what you described already, that this canon was not so solid from this point of view. And I have in my mind something that I don't know how much known Greek philosopher of 20th century, Cornelius Castoriadis,
Oh yeah.
underlined many times when he used to speak about the ancient Greek philosophy, that the whole point of the Western philosophy and actually the Greek thought has to do with the non-being, not with the being, but
Yes.
has to do with the chaos and the non-being, and something that is more connected with pre-Socratics and not so much about the contradiction of Aristoteles and Plato. So I would like to give you a pass from this point of view around the concept of nature. And I have in my mind two things. The first one is that we have a world that coming from a society, a European society, that coming from the plague and the Black Death, and
Mhm.
I mean a certain representation of nature, death, and life inside the everyday life. And on the other hand, we still have a certain ideal image of the city that coming from the Platonism, and I mean from the politia and the ideal city that, especially in the Italian heritage, and I mean about the urban heritage of Renaissance cities, it's something that is very strong and powerful. So, how can we philosophize about nature using these two parts of everyday life, the nature and the death, as something that in everyday life used to be a kind of friend and advisor for the people, and on the other hand, of a certain architecture and urban planning of the lives that used to influence the elites or the lower strata of this period.
Yeah, I think that the question of nature becomes the question of nature taken also from, as he was pointing, in relation to Plato, so to the ideal city, to what we can find even in the late, no, in the wonderful. I think it's one of my favorite um, examples of a lived thought, that of Plato, between the differences between the Republic and the laws. The Republic, which is already a plan, which pertains to, of course, like a discussion on physics, on nature, but it's also a discussion on the future. It's the discussion that takes on what can be done of the human, of politics. What can we construct in order to live in the best way? And then you can see this shift in Plato, in the laws, where he becomes a little more, let's say, even paranoid. If we remember the figure of the Athenian, which talks about the city, not anymore as something like the communion of virtuous people governed by the philosophers, but it becomes something that must be surveilled. A city is something, says Plato in the body of the Athenian, in the words of the Athenian, it's an enormous animal. It's an enormous animal that must be always awake, that must have ears and eyes everywhere. It's something very dystopian that comes about after an utopistic definition of what the city is in early Plato or the mature Plato, so the in Real Republic. But yeah, the question of nature moving to the subject like that is Renaissance, I think that uh, that in the Renaissance there is already some kind of what we can call with Heidegger the technological understanding of being, you know? So we can think that there is already this project of mastering nature, in a sense, through knowledge. It's the application, it's a real practice of knowing and applying systematically applying knowledge. So think about Leonardo da Vinci's inventions, Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, studies, and then the application in the war machines, think, or the flying machine, some and on other examples in that direction. So, in that sense, I think, and this mastering of nature pertains also to art. And I think it's in this sense, Renaissance is proto-modern. So then nature becomes something to be, in a sense, classically repressed, measured, even reproduced, if it's possible, and ultimately, in a sense, governed. So a standing reserve, as in Heidegger's sense, so the Gestell, the dispositif, available for human use. In fact, the human is homo faber. He knows how to fabricate. And to fabricate, you have to take resources and model them. So that I think that this representational mastery, which is exactly a problem, like it's a philosophical problem because it's a problem of representation, of correspondence between, you know, word meaning and word meaning and the word, which once signified human dignity. Let's say, let's think about the Greeks and the creativity, maybe now appears complicit with the long arc in a sense of ecological domination and extraction. It's that this is one of the problematic, maybe, germs that we can find in Renaissance, and this is maybe one of my most speculative points, that it's the present ecological crisis may indeed call for an anti-Renaissance stance, which means not to be opposite to everything that the Renaissance uh, represents, of course, but and in fact not in the rejection of humanism or creativity, but in the name of, for example, of a humility. So if the relation between Renaissance and anti-Renaissance is something, it's definitely a calling for humility, for recognition of what pertains to a certain period, even if it's excluded, to what pertains to a certain culture, even if it's rejected. So that, well, an example, interesting example in these days can be Euque cosmotechnics. So that's it becomes something that becomes crucial, that the idea that every technology carries within itself a cosmology, so a moral order and an image of the word. So that if Renaissance representation was a cosmotechnics of, let's say, visibility, domination, mastery of nature, perhaps what is needed today is a counter to that cosmotechnics, or an integration of that cosmotechnics is in a broader perspective, so that one that affirms opacity, interdependence, the irreducibility of natural processes to human schemata, and of human schemata to the natural processes, though an asymmetry. That otherwise we're just going to back to naturalism. We're just going back to a regresso ad unum, and it's completely useless, I think. But the task is not to undo Renaissance, of course, but to decompose its metaphysics, which is still at work today. So to listen again to to what is beneath clarity. So to understand exactly, as you said before with Castoriadis, taking care of non-being, or I'm rereading Spectres of Marx by Derrida,
Mm.
exactly taking care of specters, taking care of ghosts instead of just what is in front of our eyes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's and I want to connect this reference with the whole debate of our days around post-human and if we are living the end of the human, and pretty sure it's something that connected with our discussion for the Renaissance, because from one point of view, many people support that what we are living today with this independence of technology and artificial intelligence and all this direction of intelligent system is the next episode after the World War II, and a new phase in the destruction of the human. And I'm not so sure if it's something like that. And many times I have in my mind the book of Badiou around the inhuman, the 20th century, and what's going on generally today. And I think that this calm approach from our point of view about Renaissance contributions and what you pretty declare for a different kind of ecological need is something that we have to put on the dialogue. But which is your opinion about this moment, this crucial moment around human, post-human, or inhuman that somehow drive the whole um, technological or post-industrial society today?
Well, I definitely think that the idea of the idea of transhumanism,
Mm.
the positions of transhumanism, or even the substitution of the human by AI and everything else, blah blah blah, it's definitely connected to the concept of Homo faber. It's something that the Homo faber survives, definitely. It's mutated that because I think that, okay, maybe the Renaissance humanism is something that is not anymore sustainable, but that doesn't mean, in a sense, that it doesn't mean we have to throw it away. That's why I really like Francois Laruelle, because he's the one, after quite some time, that posits again the human in the center, the human in the center of the philosophical discussion, or philosophical, non-philosophical discussion, but in a sense of theory, or the sense of speculation, instead of the centering. So
It's
that,
true. It's true.
and that's to me, it's absolutely great. And I think that mm, in the example of transhumanism, let's think, which was something that seemed old, but today, I don't know if you saw the Peter Thiel's latest interviews. It's not at all. It's not all. It's actually contemporary. Transhumanism is something that now, as an idea, it's not sci-fi anymore. It's not old sci-fi, old-fashioned sci-fi. It become very contemporary again. Um, so, as I said, look, Homo faber, transhumanism, and AI substitution. They probably are connected to one another. But I think that they are connected in a way that it's transcends the bound of Renaissance humanism itself. So what was once an affirmation of the human as the rational, autonomous center of creation, has now drifted into a post-human, of course, horizon. So that first, it's funny to see how, if we are moving over that, uh, but the language is the same, let's say that the kind of um, representation is the same, then, or we are not talking of humanity, of the human in post-humanity, and and that does make sense. But or we are not talking about the human in the humanist renaissance. So I think that this resonates quite in a way with Lyotard, with the question Jean-François Lyotard poses in the first essay of his Inhuman collection of essays, which is, can thought go on without a body? So that a question that isn't merely speculative, but reveals like the underlying metaphysics of our current technological condition, I think. So that it asks not whether thinking can be digitally sustained, but whether thinking as we have known it, so embodied, affective, contingent, has ever truly been grasped in the first place. As I was talking about Peter Thiel before, like one figure like that explains and illustrates this drift starkly, I think. In a recent the recent interview, the question that the interviewer posed was, should the human race survive? And there was a long hesitation in respect to the answer to this question. And even the answer was, well, yes, but the human must be redone, must be remade. So the Homo faber becomes even the faber of itself, in a sense. So it's a kind of an unspoken fantasy of substitution. Substitution or of the bodily, of the body, of the parts of the body, or even of the complex in general, the complete system of the human with something artificial, something that uh, it's even in a sense uninteresting in the sense that it calls for a kind of stoicism applied to machines. So we have to a kind of superficial stoicism. I don't want to insult Stoics, but a kind of superficial stoicism that refutes what makes the human a desirable, an animal of desires, an animal of instincts, an animal of pathos, in going toward the otheology of reason. And in fact, I mean, I think this is why I think that the challenge today, it's not simply to reject transhumanism or to claim that the man-machine hybrid will no longer be human or will never happen. I think that the kind of statement anyway misses the deeper point, which is that the real issue is in a kind of way ontological. And it pertains to the question, what do we mean by human? So if we look at the Renaissance human and we look at the post-human, transhuman human, and we find connections, that is already a kind of that should ring a bell in me. I mean, if we're talking about something that must be something that is not human anymore, and we are connecting to the human back then there is something strange. So more radically, who decided what counts as human? The question that maybe Sylvia Wynter would pose, and most importantly, when. So that the human is in this context become less a biological or metaphysical given, and more an historical decision, a cultural decision, even a Western artifact. So continually reshaped by its technologies of extension, of its their prosthesis. So transhumanism doesn't transcend the human, it simply reduces it. So it to cognition, for example, that is the sociology of reason, to cognition, to productivity, to code, to even to clarity. There is also a gnoseology behind that. So we have never fully known what we are. That's a kind of that's the most exciting thing about contemporary philosophy. So our history is a history of prostheses, tools, images, languages, networks, and so on, and each of which we have named as extensions of ourselves, each of which reflects back a partial image, a partial representation of that we mistake for the whole. So it's always a partial connections. So Sylvia Wynter, in fact, calls for a science of the human. That there is the theory of the human is one of the more important contributes of her work. that aims to displace this overrepresentation or overrepresented figure, which is man in the Renaissance sense, in some of the Renaissance sense, but also in the Enlightenment sense and so on, and inaugurate something more hybrid, transdisciplinary conception of the human being. So that one that can account for our symbolic, biosocial, mythic dimension, even. All that pertains to that is called, like, all that pertains to what philosophy excludes, classical philosophy excludes, myth, um, sophistry, the foreigner, like in Plato, like in Aristotle, that must be retaken, integrated again as part of a history, as part of a body, as part of a memory. So that, like, put simply, and to conclude, because Winter asked us to, I think, to recognize, for example, that what we take for the human is not a neutral or universal category. So that when we talk about transhumanism, posthumanism, or even humanism in some sense, we are making politics. We are
Mm.
making political acts, very strong political acts, because they are structured, they are constructions and representations, I think.
Wow, yes, it's I think a spectacular idea, and uh, I have in my mind what we discussed during our latest vidcast with Professor Senaldi, and when described to me the era of Italian avant-garde, etc., said to me that okay, we were Marxists, but only futurism supported us to think with indeterminacy outside of any kind of teleology. And this need for a kind of futurality in order to use something that, or futurity, to use something that coming also from Laruellian lexicon. I think that is very important because opens what you described, how we want to still consider ourselves um, open entities, open exist modes of beings, and not something that is closed. And from yes, this maybe make the whole debate around humanism and posthumanism less dramatic and eschatological. So, do you think that? Because today you have already mentioned many times, we need a different mode of existence outside of any kind of domination. That even this kind of rationality, even this kind of world that we are living today, and this kind of mode of thinking that we are living today, is a certain form of domination that actually failed. And all this incorporation of the specters and the shadows and everything is what we really need in order to, let's say, restart a new kind of politics. How do you think about
Yeah, it's quite a question. Well, yeah, I mean, the re let's situate my research concerns, for example. Like, what draws me to Laruelle is an attempt by him to manifest the way, for example, philosophical discourse, which was, and maybe is still, but mainly was uh, a very influential form of discourse which aimed at, well, in a most superficial sense, in constructing a discourse of truth, no, a discourse of truth without mediation. So I am not telling you the truth with myth. I'm not telling you, or I'm not using language to deceive you as the sophists, but I am talking from the place of truth in order to illuminate discourse and illuminate everything, illuminate relations, and making possible for relations to constitute into a politeia and so on, blah blah blah. And philosophy has always been, well, in its origin, has been a kind of exclusionary form of discourse. Exclusion in the sense that the way myth is manifested in philosophy by philosophy is myth in philosophy. So it's the way, let's say, philosophy constructs its definition of truth and then says to the others, you don't speak that truth. You're not good. So Laruelle is interesting because it tries to move outside of the self-legitimized work of philosophy in respect to its own authority. So, in constructing the premises of the legitimation for its own discourse, in order to make something else, which is non-philosophy, which would be this kind of non-decisional thought. Why non-decisional? Because for Laruelle, philosophy is always decisional in the sense that there is always philosophy always needs a starting point. And this is the division between thinking and reality, for example, subject and object, and so on. And then the task of philosophy is that of uh, closing that division. So you play, you make the cake and you eat it, in a sense. But that the thing exactly with interesting to me in respect to unknowing, to the non-knowledge, which is not ignorance, it's something else. And what is? It's something that may appear as exactly in the concept of decision. No, when you do a decision, when you make a decision, it's not implied. Knowledge may pertain to a decision, but it's not implied in the decision. You cannot know the consequences of a decision. So a decision, in a sense, it's not a philosophical, cannot be a full philosophical object. Otherwise, we are talking about uh, predicting the future, but we're not doing that. So what you can define in relation to a decision is just maybe the choices, but your possible choices, but not the consequences. So that kind of unknowing, it means to me a kind of inhabiting or a kind of being with what cannot be integrated ever by neither discourse apart from the fact of being present in the consequence. So making a decision and being victim of the consequences. So that in relation to and Laruelle discussion, Laruelle non-philosophy aims to be democratic. Aims to be in stating this non-philosophy is what precedes philosophy, is what precedes philosophy exactly in this as this space of decision, the space of relation to the decision. So that means that its real position or posture is that of the ordinary man, not of the man of philosophy, for example, which is the man who represents the man or the woman that represents the exemplary person, the person who knows how to deploy thinking in the most exemplary way. It's already defined. It's already something that acquires a kind of authority in respect to something that it's defined by philosophy itself, no? So that what's striking, I think, in Laruelle is that against all odds, he recuperates the human. So, but not a masterful subject, not a figure of exceptionalism or metaphysical privilege. Instead, Laruelle's gesture is to rescue the human from philosophy itself. And this is why it's beautiful to put non-philosophy and the question we are interested today, like and Renaissance together, because we're not trying to say we're not trying to rejecting or cancelling or erasing philosophy as in the same way we are not erasing or completely criticizing the Renaissance. So that uh, this gesture, Ruel puts it, at rescue of the human from decision, division, representations, blah, 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 is the same that constructed, no, sorry, the gesture against which Laruelle moves, is the one that historically constructed man as a dominant category. So in texts like, I think one text is particularly interesting, which is The Future Christ,
Yes.
or Principle of Non-Philosophy for a more general introduction in non-philosophy. Laruelle introduces the idea of generic humanity. This is the most crucial thing, I think. A human not defined by reason, is not defined by power, is not defined by history, but by radical immanence, so by being in one, he says, prior to any structure of thought, which is, I think, in a sense, we can understand it as the most immediate way of lived experience. So the lived experience that we always do, that we always live, that we always are in, before beginning to think, before beginning to philosophize. No? So this is a profound, I think, reversal. So rather than they reject humanism as inherently violent or contaminated, blah, 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 Laruelle invents a non-decisional humanism, one that begins with the human as already lived, as prior to representation and untouched by hierarchical logics of mastery, for example. And it is also a humanism without nostalgia, so without the lure of antiquity, without triumph, and crucial, without domination. Then it does not aim to uplift the human as a sovereign subject, but to equalize thought with life, in a sense, to practice a humility before the real, that for him, no philosophical system can ever grasp. So I think that probably was a confusing answer because, yeah, I get the Laruelle is it's pretty complex. It's pretty complex to me, but it's fascinating, and I think that the one answer it could be also that the political the political side comes definitely after a polishing of what philosophy, which is not just a discipline, but is a posture that pertains to the Western culture in general. When we investigate and sift that in a way that opens us new ways of understanding what the human is, what can be, or even not deciding if we want to construct a strong image of the human, but staying with what we are in a maybe collective way. Yeah, that is something I have to think through. But it's pretty.
It's um,
What you
I
think?
have to admit that I totally agree because described a, a real a real third dynamic beyond this binary of Renaissance or anti-Renaissance or this kind of argue with rationalism or with irrationalism. And at the same time, I totally agree that Laruelle gives us the opportunity to think something that for me is very important. But civil society is the space, the politics, and exactly because there this kind of generic humanity has the freedom to 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 be independent of any kind of political ideology or of any kind of philosophy that explains to humanity what is the politics. And personally, I believe that this is the whole need about a redefinition of what does it mean today, civil space, public space, civil society, because we need a space for this kind of generic humanity, that the basic criteria are not coming from the power, not coming from the authority, not coming from the party system, any kind of party system, or any teleological, ideological explanation that our life be perfect and utopian and we are going to follow this and that, but only with living in equally in a space that we acknowledge each other as citizens that coming from this generic humanity. but it does need to have something more in order to to identify your fundamental right to be part of this one. And yes, it's the example, the case of Laruelle, especially for a new effort to speak about the democracy from a non-philosophy point of view is something fantastic. So finally, Filippo, if we want to connect our discussion with people that are working somehow with determinations around how much important is the thought heritage. Because the most important thing is what we have as an inheritance in our minds. And do you think that practically we can follow today new initiatives to design new projects and to do, I mean, practical steps in order to move towards the future and stop to be restricted and imprisoned on this dichotomy between what is human and unhuman? How how do you believe that I mean could make feasible steps in order to be closer to this why not Laruellian uh, vision?
Yeah, well, while you were talking, I was thinking about, because in relation to Senaldi's vidcast, about someone like Antonio Santelia, no? Orange, and like I'll take him because I'm absolutely fascinated by his work of space, his understanding of space, and his vision. And that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to think about a thing, a architect like him, a someone who imagines, instead of imagining people, of imagining the person, he's imagining the space in which the person is. That's something very interesting, but also today in a sense is very problematic because communities maybe of people can be global. There is no band, could be no boundary. Like you are in Athens, I'm in Turin. I could be in Bogota. There is no problem. I mean, so even the work, even the thinking of space, maybe it's a little bit, it has become a little bit problematic in that sense. So that, um, I mean, I find for me personally, in my research, and even in my life, in a sense, that very problematic the two impulses between the deconstruction of is our what are the influences and the history of our society and the way we see things, we will say our worldviews, and also toward instead a more creative tendency, no? So that there cannot be, I think, that one without the other. That's, I mean, that would be, or being the destroyer of worlds, or the creator, like in a kind of messianic. I think that what pertains to humanity is this play between unraveling and rebuilding. So nurture, maybe cure. The relation between the constructing and creating, I think it's not dialectical synthesis in a sense, but a restless uh, entanglement, a structural tension maybe that resists closure in a kind of Hegelian way. Maybe I think about myself maybe sometimes as functioning Hegelianly in an Hegelian way. But I also recognize something like, think to connect to Eugenio Battisti again, maybe to Warburg, that the Renaissance and anti-Renaissance, to stay on our topic, like it's are not things that are opposite, for example, but co-constitutive. they co-constitute what that period is and what comes after. So that the Apollonian and the Dionysiac in the same gesture, in a sense. So, like, for this is also for me absolutely important, crucial psychoanalysis. For example, Lacan. So the subject, the individual, is not something that exists fully formed, and then affirms or negates itself, the word. The subject is something that emerges, he says, through a lack, no? A rupture in being, which is always something that is very difficult to understand in Lacan. But anyway, like the most interesting part is that the Lacan subject comes into being from a kind of misrecognition of himself or misrepresentation of himself, blah, blah. And let's say, for example, the mirror stage, the infant identifies with an external image of coherence, wholeness, and mastery, and which masks instead its lived fragmentation, the body that hurts here, then he is angry, and he is, I don't know, like, yeah, the fragmentation of the body in respect to this image. And I think there we have to think through. We have to think through this double structure or double situation of what we are. So this kind of synthesizing machine that we have here or somewhere else in our body, and our bodily experience, which is much more problematic, much more fragmented, desynthesized. So the subject is, I mean, um, something we have to go back to. This is part of my research. This is part of my interest, definitely. But one thing that is important, for example, calling again Lacan, is that the subject is not a sovereign creator of meaning. So let's say, for example, from Renaissance part, the Renaissance embodiment, the creator of meaning. For Lacan, is the the subject is not the sovereign. It's everything that everything that every word he uses, everything that he comes across, it's everything inherited. Everything, the words, the way the words are structured, the phrases, the sentences, the ideas, the images, and so on and so on. Everything apart, a little stream of personal experience that is still an experience that is structured between memories of others, inheritances. Um, it's what constitutes the subject. So the task of the subject is to inhabit both his life, their life, the actual experience of this life, and not the I must be, I must become, and so on, what I am, but also in close talk and relationship with what it's the inheritance, with the tools, the instruments, the history, the images, because those are parts of what we are, of what we talk, what we speak, what we see. Our worldview, it's like maybe in psychoanalytical sense, we have to talk with our unconscious, maybe in a Jungian sense, we have to make a discourse with our cultural unconscious, with our collective unconscious, blah, blah. But in a sense, I think that there is something very valuable there, exactly this idea of the heritage of what we are, which is contextual, situational. Uh, I cannot be anyone anywhere. It's something that we have to make value of, but as uh, not as ontologically prior to, I think, Pico della Mirandola, to the capacity of shape-shifting of each and every human being, of the capacity of the human. So I think that, yeah, this is definitely a complex question, that of how to imagine the future for the future possibilities, future spaces, future uh, democratic engagements, but maybe it has to do with how we imagine, to think through how our imagination work in the sense of the relation between the inherited discourse, the inherited tools we take from history, and what we can do with them, what we are able to do. And that, for example, the critique of authority in Laruelle. Yes, we are inheriting a tradition, but do not take the authority of that tradition too seriously. Play with it, rearrange it. There is no rule written nowhere that uh, obliges you to be too faithful, too serious to that.
Yes, you give me the pass to mention Lacan, this essay that Lacan analyzed Hamlet
Mm.
of Shakespeare, and how, if I'm not wrong, how Lacan explained the decision of the murder actually has to do with how Hamlet used the ghost of the father in order to allow to himself a kind of liberation from what rationally should follow. So it actually was not about, of course, any kind of Oedipal or fathers or patriarchal ideology, but the shadow is what Hamlet needed to construct in order to make the liberating act. And Lacan, yes, was fantastic on how describe this and release all these mechanisms around imagination. Filippo, I would like to thank you. It was not only a pleasure, but I'm sure that many people through our discussion will find new ideas and an authentic problematization about how to use our thinking, not in order to philosophize, but in order to be useful for our future possibilities. So thanks again, and for sure we'll be in touch to do many things and projects in the near future.
Absolutely.
Thanks
Thank you.
again.
It was very fun, and yeah, good luck with everything, and I hope to see you again soon.
Of course,
Thank you.
thanks.